We have talked to hundreds of couples who work together, invest together, want to work together, invest together, have tried to work together, invest together, but it doesn't work. Whatever the situation is, we've talked to hundreds of those couples. And one of the truisms that I've found is that the ease at which you can accomplish kind of this lifestyle thing is directly proportionate to how much the two people in the relationship are aligned. If one person in the relationship is really entrepreneurial and thinking this is like, we can do this and we're willing to take the risk, and worst thing that happens is we can't figure it out, one of us has to go back to work, or worst thing that happens is we lose our life savings and we have to start over, and the other person agrees, it tends to be really easy. The problems arise when one person's kind of a risk taker, not even a risk taker, but is willing to accept the risks for those rewards, and the other person is very risk averse. Their attitude is, I don't want to lose a penny. I don't want to risk doing something where I have to go back to work. I don't want to risk losing money and having to rebuild. When the two are mismatched, that's where the problems arise. With my wife and myself, we were so fortunate that literally on day one, there was never any question. We both went into it with the attitude, if it doesn't work, worst case, we go back to the corporate world. If it doesn't work, worst case, we move into an apartment from our house. If it doesn't work, worst case, we rebuild from scratch. We know that we'll do it together. We know we can do it. And so there was never any that doubt of what happens if, because we were both aligned with, if something bad happens, we deal with it. And so for us, there never was a tremendous amount of fear, because we both realized that the worst case scenario, and we've kind of lived our lives when we jump into something new, we think, what is the worst case scenario? How can we mitigate it if it happens? How do we keep it from happening? And what do we do if it does happen? And as long as you're always aligned on those three things, how to keep it from happening, how to mitigate it if it does happen, and what do you do if you can't mitigate it? If you're aligned on those three things, then it takes the fear away, because you realize that you're prepared for that worst case scenario.
So I want to jump in here a little bit, because I think what you just shared is really important when it comes to fear. You just pretty much shared a strategy, I think, that you guys successfully use to eliminate some of that fear, to dissipate that fear. Because you look at like, what's the worst thing that can happen? Because a lot of times when people are fearful about taking some kind of an action, they have this build up idea in their head that, oh my God, I'm going to live in a van down by the river. You know what I mean? So I think it's a great strategy. And
here's the thing. If you live in a van down by the river, that sucks. But put your head in that mind space. Think about that. If that's really the worst possible outcome, the absolute worst possible outcome, now compare it to the upside. Compare it to the best possible outcome, or the most reasonable possible outcome. A lot of times, if you put it into those terms, you think, it's really unlikely I'm going to end up living down in a van by the river. But what if I do? How horrible is that? Great. I go back to work. I get another job. I start something that's a lot less risky. I go do some consulting. Whatever it is probably going to make that worst case scenario not seem as bad. And let me tell you something. When the trade-off of living in a van down by the river, when the trade-off, the possible upside is living a life that you dreamed about, a lot of us are going to be willing to take that risk of living in a van down by the river. Now, if the worst case scenario is somebody's going to die, somebody's going to be unhealthy, somebody's going to be in a bad situation for the rest of their life, that's horrible. Then maybe you don't do it. But again, if the worst case scenario is you have to move into an apartment, the worst case scenario is you have to go back to get a job, a lot of times that's really not that bad. People just don't think about it. They just kind of have this amorphous kind of vague notion that really bad things can happen. Well, stop. Think about what specifically that really bad thing is, and then put those in terms that you understand. Is that really the worst thing in the world? I lived in a tiny apartment for most of my life. After college, as I was growing up, back when I lived in California and I couldn't afford like more than a 1-bedroom efficiency. So that really isn't that horrible of a worst case scenario.
Dude, I think that is so powerful, because no doubt that in that same exact perspective not only helped you be successful at the beginning when you decided to make that jump from the corporate world into real estate, but every decision thereafter, like for, hey, should we do this property? Should we expand? Should we buy this building? Should we do this investment? Whatever. That same mentality, like really, I think objectifies what could be subjective, what somebody could, like Peter said, build up in their mind as being this really scary thing that is just all encompassing. No, now you're classifying it, you're categorizing it, you're objectifying it to make it something concrete and tangible, and then you make a decision based, on objective weights and measures. But dude, I love that. That's fantastic. So,
and let me also add that age plays a big factor. For anybody out there that's young and listening to this, go take chances. Go not put everything on the line, but go take some risks, because time is the biggest corrector of all mistakes. And it's harder. I'm approaching 50 now. And so it's harder for me to take those big risks now than it was a dozen years ago. And it would have been even easier a dozen years before that. So for anybody out there that's young and thinking, okay, well, next year I'll take the big risk, or 5 years from now, or 10 years when I've built up a little bit of a nest egg. Well, let me tell you something. 10 years from now, yeah, you might have a little bit more money in the bank account, but you have lost 10 years of potential risk mitigation. So don't wait, do it now.